Good evening and good morning, depending on wherever you are joining from. I, Purushandar Singh, on behalf of CUTS International, pleased to welcome everyone to this issue-specific webinar being implemented under Defense News Conclave Project, Stories of US-India Defense Partnership. The theme of today's webinar is India's defense offset policy, challenges and opportunities. Before we dive into the informative and fruitful discussion, just setting out some house announcements. Today's session will be 1 hour and 45 minutes long. The panel will be for 1 hour and 20 minutes, after which we will have a question and answer session to make the session even more interactive, followed by closing remarks. We encourage the members of the panel to keep their cameras on during the session. Also keep your microphones on mute unless you are speaking. This session is being recorded and will be released later on the CUTS YouTube channel. It is encouraged that the audience members post their questions indicating relevant speakers in the chat box directly to me with their names and short designation. Thank you. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Kris Osborn, President and Editor-in-Chief, Warrior Maven, and Defense Editor of the National Interest, for his opening remarks. Over to you.
Hello, and thank you. A pleasure to be here. A pleasure to meet all of you visually. Thanks for having me. It's always an important day to talk about modernization, to be sure, and especially collaborative efforts, given the current threat environment, to be sure. Certainly, the third offset is an interesting thing for the Pentagon, something I've been writing about for a bit. Continues to get a lot of attention. And one of the things that caught my mind was, gosh, just the other day, I looked at a RAND study that talked about it, and I think it's fair to say it began to evolve in terms of a concept, almost in a philosophical sense. Of course, everybody observed and is seeing the continued evolution of this pivot, right, from 14 to 15 years of counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan to think in terms of great power competition. It's a clear, well-known concept, of course, and it's something I remember writing about because doctrinally and conceptually, it was one of the really key things emphasized very years ago. I remember 2011, I showed up at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, and they were already at that point thinking in terms of great power competition and looking at simulations and actual force-on-force training exercises to look at mechanized warfare on a larger scale, anticipating that indeed the landscape and the technological climate was maturing to a point where there will be a new threat calculus in coming years. So when it comes to the implementation of the third offset, God, there is so much to discuss. I'm really looking forward to hearing the expertise from this panel in particular because of how things have been implemented. I will say in a general sense, it's really quite fascinating and I would say even inspirational to look at what the Pentagon is doing now technically when it comes to multi-domain connectivity and the implementation of the third offset. Because the Pentagon, the Army, for example, has been trying for decades to do this system of systems, multi-domain information sharing, fighting at the speed of relevance, finding ways to interconnect, have the right protocols and interfaces so you can have aircraft carriers and fighter jets and tanks all receiving the same information in the same time and truncating what they call that sensor to shooter loop. I remember the Army, many of you may remember the U.S. Army's future combat systems, gosh, as many as 15 years ago. They had this concept of systems, this idea that manned and unmanned systems, that major platforms would be able to share information in real time across the force. Now, the concept was pioneering at the time. Its implementation wound up getting canceled, but what's the irony is that the sort of zeitgeist of what was future combat systems still seems to inform what's actually happening now. The point being, there are breakthroughs now with networking, there are breakthroughs with multi-domain connectivity, and each of the services have made their respective contributions in a way that I think is paradigm changing when you look at something like joint all-domain command and control. So primarily, I would think of it beginning as a doctrinal and conceptual shift. And one of the things that comes to mind is something former commander of Army Futures Command, John Murray, talked about, was the extent to which new technology drives the need for new tactics and maneuver formations. So there's just as much of an important look at tactics and the application of the third offset as it's been implemented. Now, technically, there's, gosh, so much to discuss when it comes to the technical integration of what this involves. I would say in a general sense, we're thinking in terms of AI, information sharing, information processing, and multi-domain networking in terms of the decision cycle. I'm sure many of you have heard of the famous Colonel Boyd's OODA loop: observation, orient, decision, action, getting inside the opponent's decision cycle, getting the point where you make that critical decision. And now it's a point where that process has been massively accelerated. If you look at something like the Army's Project Convergence, what used to take 20 minutes to get a sensor from, say, an unmanned system to a host platform, to a human decision maker, to a shooter, as they say, whether it be an interceptor or an armored platform, to make that attack, that used to take 20 minutes. I showed up, gosh, it was 2020 in Yuma, Arizona at Project Convergence, and they've reduced that time frame to 20 seconds now. So the idea is, as they call it, fighting at the speed of relevance through networking. The idea of, they had a system they called air launch effect, which was forward operating mini drones back to larger drones, back to a platform like a helicopter, and then down on the ground to a shooter or an effector, which would be, in the case of this experiment, an infantry fighting vehicle. And what blew my mind was this is all AI driven. There's an AI system called Firestorm, and what that was used to do is gather otherwise disparate pools of incoming sensor data, kind of different streams. And as we all know, AI collects them, bounces them off a database, and makes those calculations. So what the computerized system was able to do is make recommendations to human decision makers when it comes to what is the most optimal shooter or the most optimal sensor for this particular threat. And this is where AI truly is paradigm changing, because the real migration now is to look not just in terms of data processing, but what are some of the ways that AI can approximate or replicate more subjective phenomena. That's a fascinating and cutting edge and very interesting discussion. And the more short term, when it comes to application, you have challenges and advantages. The challenges, as I said, all the advantages are really, as I said, an exponential paradigm-changing leap forward when it comes to fighting at the speed of relevance and multi-domain connectivity. I mean, this year it was very much international Project Convergence with a look at interoperability. In previous years, it's also air-ground interconnectivity. So information as its own weapon of war is increasingly obviously heavily emphasized in the day of AI. And the F-35, for example, was able to share real-time information with ground troops. So the US within the military services is very much looking at this synergy and this multi-domain connectivity with a mind to further expansion. What are the protocols? What are the transport layers? What are the interfaces you need to ensure secure transmission of combat-relevant, time-sensitive data between different militaries, not only the US military services, but of course, other militaries like India. So that's been one of the main challenges, which leads me technically to a key point, and many of you have probably heard of gateways, this idea of a system that's essentially like a translator. You have a transport layer like an RF signature coming in, a data link of some kind, perhaps wireless or GPS, and all of these different or otherwise segregated or federated systems of incoming data are gathered, organized, and the formats, the protocols, the common standards, the IP protocol is configured such that one transport layer can then communicate with another. And there's been some breakthroughs in this area. There was a radio called Freedom 550 that allows the F-22 and the F-35 to share information while preserving stealth mode. There's other kinds of data link breakthroughs that enable otherwise incompatible communications formats to share and analyze information. So it's really what many often refer to as, in terms of an information revolution, and finding ways to aggregate and secure that information. And this is where, well, let me quickly mention each of the services. Joint All-Domain Command and Control, Deputy Secretary Hicks recently signed an implementation agreement. This is breaking through to the next level. As I mentioned, it's the Army's Project Convergence, it's the Navy's network called Project Overmatch, and the Air Force's Advanced Battle Management System. Now, Project Overmatch is fascinating. I remember writing about the Office of Naval Research years ago, began this project called ghost fleet. And the idea was a fleet or a group of unmanned systems operating in coordination with one another autonomously, being able to share information, make adaptations in real time without necessarily needing human intervention. Of course, doctrinally, must be a human in the loop, which is another fascinating question when it comes to lethal force. But there is this idea of interconnectivity, sharing information in real time, and this idea of algorithms getting more and more advanced so that perhaps a group of unmanned systems or unmanned surface vehicles can find a vulnerable point along an enemy coastline or where it might be best to penetrate the perimeter. So there's all kinds of applications along those lines in terms of Navy. The Air Force also has had its migration with an advanced battle management system. They've been able to really do some breakthrough air-ground coordination and fire ground weapons with cues from air sensors. And of course, as all of you I'm sure know, the integration with this is not easy. There's technical elements, there's security elements, there's interoperability elements, but this is so critical because, as is widely discussed, the faster one understands the enemy's decision cycle, where a target might emerge, what effector might be the most suitable for that or optimal, and then how can that process be expedited to act in anticipation of and prior to an enemy. And it calls to mind something very important when you think of drone defenses. The Army, for example, is looking at using AI to not only recognize the threats quickly, but discern what kind of threat that is, and then what is the optimal effector. For example, if you're defending a forward operating base with an AI-enabled system, and perhaps an enemy drone's on the way, well, if it's foggy, you might not use a laser interceptor. If it's a civilian area, you might not want a kinetic explosion. So what you have is this host of variables that the database can then have compiled and be able to make those optimal recommendations. And that really leads me to the challenge. And this is something that could be talked about for so long. It's this question of reliability and what the Pentagon likes to refer to as zero trust. An AI system can only be as effective as its database. So what happens when an AI-enabled computer or system of sensors comes across something that's not part of its database, something that it hasn't seen before? How can it assimilate that and perform the analytics in the requisite way to make that optimal recommendation? And so there's a real effort to find ways to further implement reliability for AI so that you can essentially trust what it comes across. For example, perhaps an enemy puts a poster over a tank and the ISR, the EOIR sensors are confused and unable to make the recommendation. So there's a look now at more holistic AI in the sense of algorithms that can look at a number of variables in relation to one another. For example, what might the thermal signature be? What about the surrounding vegetation or terrain? Can those kinds of determinations be made in a reliable way should AI or a system come across something? And quickly, an example of this would be, can AI look at surrounding words in terms of context to make key distinctions? For example, could it tell the difference between ball as in football or dance as in dance ball, perhaps by looking at the surrounding words? Those are the kinds of challenges, that element of subjectivity and context that machine learning and real-time analytics, or close to real-time analytics, is looking at trying to make breakthroughs with. Once more of those breakthroughs are made, like I recently spoke with the commander of the Air Force Research Lab, and that's precisely what she talked about, is that AI in the aggregate is very much data-driven at this point, as it should be, and the question is, how do you get to some of those more subjective questions, human decision-making? And that reminds me of this key point. When you have the Air Force did a test with an with a manned fighter jet and an AI-enabled co-pilot. So the idea is optimizing. You have those variables that are unique to human cognition, and then you have those merged with the procedural benefits, the processing speed, and the analysis of a computer system like AI. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the news reports about a computer going against a human when it comes to dogfighting. So this idea of synergizing the two, finding what's optimal and best about human input, Reminds me of showing up at the Army Research Lab. They're doing a lot of cutting edge work looking at how drones can land on tanks. But if the drone isn't loaded with the proper data in advance, how can it make those adaptations in course? And that's exactly what they're looking at. How can it accommodate human input, make the adjustment, perform the necessary machine learning to land autonomously on a tank and by itself? Essentially learn in real time. So there is this look at more collective AI and fast-paced machine learning. And it reminds me of one last question, because this, gosh, with these experts, we could talk about this stuff for a week. This is quite an impressive panel, I must say. And frankly, it's an honor to be asked to contribute a bit, because this is pretty important and pretty pressing stuff with the threat equation right now. A couple quick things that I'll say. I don't know, I might be getting close on time, but one of them is this idea of autonomy and weapon systems. Whenever I write about that, I often hear, is there going to be a Terminator? Will we have armed robots anytime soon? And the idea is the technology is basically here. I remember in 2009, the Army had a robot called the Mule, the Multi-Utility Logistics Equipment Vehicle. It was armed with Javelin anti-tank missiles. And even at that time, they were thinking about the doctrinal adaptations that would be needed to ensure that human in the loop remained the case. Well, now that's still very much the case for ethical reasons, although, and other reasons, doctrinal and even operational concerns. Will potential adversaries do that too? I mean, will or not? So do soldiers need to train for a potential adversary force that includes autonomous robots who are armed and capable of making decisions autonomously? So the Pentagon is very much wrestling with a question right now regarding out-of-the-loop AI and out-of-the-loop autonomy. Is there a potential application for the defensive use of AI-enabled systems for non-lethal force? Perhaps you have an interceptor, drone defense of some kind. Perhaps there's a system which can, as we talked about earlier, perform that requisite sensor-to-shooter calculation faster than an enemy decision cycle and save time, give commanders more options with which to pick which countermeasure might be best suited for a given threat scenario. That speed is what this is all about. And AI can enable that speed. And the question is, do you allow for an out-of-the-loop application? And I spoke with one of the most cutting-edge, Mr. Ross Rastishi, I believe is his name. He was the former East Asian lead for cyber for the Pentagon. And one of the things he talked about was this is ambiguous and difficult, because when you have more subjective determinations, perhaps a drone does have a person. Perhaps the terrain is potentially populated. What if something misfires and potentially hits a civilian? So all these calculations when it comes to ambiguity and verification that are necessary. So I think it's safe to say the Pentagon is purely at a conceptual phase of looking at defensive use. If you think about something like hypersonics and the speed at which they would need to be found, seen, and tracked, remember General Hyten from a former deputy, I don't know if you call it deputy, vice chief of staff, I believe it was, at a missile defense conference, talked about the primary challenge being to see the threats. You can't intercept a threat until you see that threat. So this question of out-of-the-loop and autonomy is so principal for modernization and what's going on. The Pentagon is achieving massive breakthroughs right now, and that includes collaboration with allies, and mostly in terms of sharing information, multi-domain. And then one last quick thing was, I'm sure the experts on this know a whole lot about the U.S.-Indian collaboration than myself. I remember writing about India's F-21, a Lockheed plane specifically engineered for India. That several of the innovations woven into that aircraft were of great interest and quite significant that I recall writing about. One of them was infrared search and track, which was initially an F-18 upgrade for a maritime war environment. And the idea is to make sensors more EW environment capable, longer range, and help with image fidelity when it comes to target recognition. So it's quite interesting that obviously the importance of India, the importance of US-Indian collaboration on the military front, looking at the threat equation. is of great significance. And so it struck me, I hadn't come across that a special variant was specifically made for India. And when you think about air power, that's pretty important. One of the things, you just take a look at the Pacific and you realize that the Marines have the F-35B and there's the F-35C. It's really fifth generation air power that might offer that window of supremacy to stop an amphibious assault on Taiwan or defend the border along India, which leads me to my last question, which is reading the Chinese papers a little bit. Two things I want to point out. One is there is, of course, a military component to Tibet. There are exercises in specific military vehicles written about publicly in the Chinese papers that are specific for high altitude, to fight in plateaus, to kind of further militarize those portions of China, which often gets obscured by concern and discussion regarding Taiwan. That's of great significance. And the last thing I would say is it's not just the much discussed and concerning technology copycat type stuff that you can see with China. And just an extra Pentagon essay talked about how the J-20 or J-31 look a lot like the F-35. One of the things I noticed reading the Chinese papers is there's very much a tactical effort to mirror or replicate some of the tactical training that the U.S. is doing in a breakthrough capacity. Couple of quick examples. One is there are articles about what they call the intelligentized warfare, which is essentially their effort to mirror or copy or try to match the U.S.'s JADC-2. Can that kind of information sharing and that interoperability be achieved across multiple domains?
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, that's all.
Go on during the discussion and have this fruitful. Thank you again for being here and delivering these detailed, insightful opening remarks. I would now like to hand over the reins of the webinar to our moderator, so Subimal Bhattacharjee, an independent consultant on defense and cybersecurity and former country lead dynamics in India, who would introduce our distinguished panel and take the webinar forward. Kris, you can join in.
Thank you, Purushendra, and good evening to all the distinguished panelists. I really loved, as Kris was speaking, because AI, machine learning, autonomous systems, these are all going into the future, and this is what I also do a lot in my, capacity these days with my clients. And I also like the reference to FCS, Kris, because we also here two armored vehicle program, the FICV and FRCV. These are on the plate. And you mentioned about the 2009 Mule. In 2009, FICV had started, but till day, after two iterations, also nothing has really moved forward. So how futuristic this actually remain is a question. But since we are in a session to look at how the Indian offsets has taken off, the challenges, the opportunities, and is there a requirement for course correction? And you cannot have better panelists or the gentleman and the lady that we have here. They are just stupendous. So I am very, very fortunate to be given the opportunity to moderate this. Offsets from 2005 till date, there's been so much of conversations, whether in the government circles or the industry circles. Still, what is the best balance? Possibly none of us know. And if you see even the questions in Parliament, I was just trying to look at that how would the ministry or how the whole country, the leadership looks at offset. And the intent, of course, was to develop the Indian domestic defense industry, taking advantage of what comes from the wisdom and experience of the large foreign OEMs implementing the program. But if you look at the answer provided on the 1st of August this year to Parliament about the amount of offsets the last 15 years, it's US dollar 6.83 billion, and 82% of that, has actually been sent across as a proposal till that day. Now, that's possibly a good part of the statistic, but the bad part is that 15 companies have actually missed the first deadline set for the implementation, and penalties have also been applied. Now, the question is that was there a certain sense of unpreparedness in the implementation and the lead cycle for understanding and then implementing it, and then of course the penalty part, or was there a scenario where everyone could have been given some more leniency and all, and or how do you optimize the performance, because the concerns were across the geographical base. It's not only restricted to the US companies, the French companies have also faced it, or anybody else. So I think I really thank Cuts for taking this up and getting this distinguished panel to talk. As the time and schedule and the serial of the speakers have been provided, but we are a little bit behind that, exactly 10 minutes behind it. So I'm going to start with Air Marshal M. Matheswaran, who's now the chairman and president the Peninsula Foundation, Chennai. Air Marshal Matheswaran has been one of the most forthright from the Air Force leadership to engage with the industry, to come and talk very, very effectively, and got the industry also to participate in a very, very positive way, as when he held the mantle in the Air Force leadership. So I'm going to introduce each one of you as you speak, and so I'd hand over the floor to Air Marshal Matheswaran. Basically, the intervention from you, sir, would be that do you think there is a need to go beyond a defense offset policy and look at a much larger national offset policy? What has been the role of the Defense Offset Facilitation Agency? And is India actually, or what is India really looking at, and is it achieving in this 15 years of what it intended? And can offsets offer a path towards strengthening the domestic arms industry and economic development? We are at an age and time where we are talking of Atmanirbharta and Make in India in a very, very significant way. So all of that, sir, your wisdom we would like to gather. So over to you, Air Marshal Matheswaran.
Thank you, Subimal, and thanks, Cuts, for this wonderful panel discussion that you've organized. I have 6 minutes as per the direction, correct? It's quite a lot to pack in with the question that's given, but I suppose we can come back again in the second session as well.
Sure.
Well, I think let me start with the first question. Is there a need to go beyond the defense offset policy and formulate a national offset policy? I think it's an excellent question, and let me touch upon that. So offsets are practiced by nearly 130 odd countries today. We are one of the late entrants into the offset game. When we started in 2005, a lot of transformation in the defense acquisition process. We were also behind time in energizing private industry into the defense. For more than 50 years, we had actually banned private industry from coming into defense. That's one. So there are a lot of disadvantageous positions with which we started off, looking at the offset issue. That is one part. And offsets have different requirements for different countries. Correct? There are many countries which are smaller who are not looking at, the indigenization in a big way and setting up, major critical technologies, capabilities within their country, because they obviously it's beyond them in terms of finances, economics, and skilled resources as well. But they play around with counter trade and indirect offsets, and they work on this. So most countries like Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, if Indonesia, Thailand, they work on these kind of models. Country like India is always focused on, and that's what Kris highlighted in this entire process, the importance of technology. And once again, we are a late starter. We need a lot to catch up, and therefore leapfrogging is one of the important strategies. And we, apart from indigenous research and a lot of investments in indigenous processes, offset is one of the mechanisms through which we should have been able to leverage. I was in the first offset committee, and the chairman was the former chairman of one of the public sector units. And the mindset and the process of looking at offset, the India's approach to offset is to leverage significant technological capabilities through its large purchases and fill in the gaps as far as possible in its critical technology requirements. As a major country, a country that wants to remain, become fairly independent, of not be dependent for critical technologies on outside, powers, even though we'll have very good relationships and strategic partnerships with countries, US is a great example, and France, but we want to be independent. And therefore, it is a great struggle for India. And therefore, you'll have to look at all mechanisms. So offset was one of the routes we logically, correctly selected it. We should have looked at it very carefully. And we went through a lot of discussions, but there was one hindrance that came into play. Many felt we are not ready to absorb if the offsets come in. The industry doesn't have a sufficient base. And therefore, we only look at direct offsets, limited to 30% of the procurement. 300 crores was the minimum limit that was put in that policy. And then they said it actually became a part of a counter trade limited to public sector units and few defense industries. That's a fundamental flaw in the policy that we brought in. I fought in that, and I actually said, you must start from day one and offset in a holistic manner. India needs, and that comes from understanding what we really need in terms of what are the gaps we need to fill. And therefore, we need to bring in both indirect as well as direct offsets, not limit ourselves to only direct offsets, and that too limited to, initially it was public sector. We brought in the changes in 2010 and 2013. We tried to bring in some elements of indirect offset, but the whole process has got, I would say, gone off track. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why I would say it's ineffective. I wouldn't say call it as a failure, because there are some, benefits that have come in, accrued, and some industries have benefited from that. But fundamentally, from India's perspective, offset is an extremely important requirement. It should have been a holistic policy. It needs to be developed. It needs to flow across both defense and non-defense sectors. It needs to go into private industries, civil aviation industries, into research and development as well. And therefore, a holistic policy needs to be developed. Let me give a few examples. In the success stories of some offsets, now private industry has come in. It was an offset mechanism that allowed them to build. TASL built their facilities in Hyderabad, which is initially manufacturing the empennage of the C-130. That is the 130J offset coming into play. Also, Sikorsky helicopter, the fuselage modules. It is a very, very basic start. But since they are starting in the process, I think it's a good experience. Now, over a decade later, I think Tata is much wiser for that experience. And therefore, they can actually grow. On the other hand, the civil aviation, Tata Aerostructures in Nagpur worked with both Boeing and Airbus, and they've set up a manufacturing facility which is 100% export oriented, which Boeing takes off and Airbus takes off all that is produced there. That's another good example of what has been done. So I think, the process is to understand where our gaps lie. For example, aero engine development. The Kaveri is a classic example. We worked on it for more than 3 decades. And there are certain critical areas in technologies where we need assistance. Nobody gives you technologies. Technology transfer is spoken about by everybody. What you get easily or what you get after a lot of struggle is production technologies. If, as Kris said, if they want to give F-21, they will not give you the core design knowledge. Even now, even though the F-16, F-21 is basically an F-16, more than four decades old design, even then, that will not come to you easily. So our purchases have to be leveraged. So an offset policy, even if you don't have an offset policy, countries have used their purchases to leverage, and that is actually an offset in practice. And no better example than Chinese, no better example than Indonesians. So I think we need to study this very carefully and look at how we need to evolve this policy. That's one. In that context, so to the answer to the first question is very clearly, yes, there is a requirement for a holistic national offset policy. We need to do that. The second part is the role of DOFA. One of the fundamental reasons for failure or ineffectiveness of the offset implementation is the way we've structured the DOFA. Since our focus is on technology acquisition, technology transfers, implementation of those processes into the industries, you need a group that is extremely knowledgeable, sensitive, and clearly follows through those issues to be implemented. And there needs to be a continuity over many, many years. You're not going to get, somebody is not going to transfer technology and overnight you become wiser on that technology. It's a technology diffusion is a long process and skill development is a long process. And therefore, this needs a national strategy. The offset strategy needs to be linked to a national security strategy with respect to defense industrialization, but also to in the civil sector, civil aviation sector, civil shipping sector. There are so much of commonality that will come in, you can actually bring it in. And that's how China has worked. China has actually played around with many of these strategies to actually leverage their huge purchases. And therefore, I think we need to look at the offset policy from a national perspective. We need to look at from a national strategy over a long period of time. We need to have continuity in implementation and practice of the policy. Most people who are against, and we've actually, I think we've messed up the offset policy currently by diluting it, is because they're looking at a short term. And from a foreign vendor perspective, he's looking at business. He's not interested in giving you technology. It is we who have to leverage that. And that is one of the flaws in the existing policy as well. There is not much of firmness and control that we exercise in leveraging what we want. On the other hand, we actually give the freedom to the vendor to actually decide whom to choose, which are the technology he wants to give. So I think these are some of the major flaws in the existing system. And the objective is very clear. So the national objective is to address some of the critical technology gaps for us to leapfrog with this process. This is one of the tools. This is not the only tool. This is one of the tools, right? But it's a very effective tool if it's used intelligently. I'll stop here and then we'll look at it.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir, for those remarks. I think they are very, very relevant. I'll now come to Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka. Sanjay ji is an independent researcher on international politics, security issues, and a senior fellow with the Delhi Policy Group. I've known him for years. We communicate regularly, when each of us write our columns. So Sanjay ji, I would basically want you to, touch on the evolution of the offset policies, the impacts on the economic development and the shortcomings, of course, which both of us alluded to. And then the need for offsets for cutting edge technologies and R&D facilities, the need to open up sectors for offsets in the non-defense sector, and how we have a action bound program, so that we achieve, the intent. So over to you, Sanjay ji.
Thank you, Subimal ji. It's wonderful to interact with you after a long time. We've been on touch on social media and other platforms. And in fact, for the benefit of other participants. When I was writing my first report on India-US defense cooperation, I used the intellectual inputs from Subimal quite a lot when I was a career. It's wonderful to catch up again on this platform. Thank you, Subimal on the points that you mentioned. A quick context, we are in a very hostile neighborhood. There is no doubt about it. An incredibly complex neighborhood that very few powers actually face. There is two-front war possibilities, constant insurgencies, terrorism, and so on. Not surprising that our defense budget is increasing, but there is also a perception that that the defense budget is not sufficient because pensions and other related expenditures are getting added into it. So fairly large amount of money or budget is going to other expenses. This is a graph that I took from Times of India, reportedly developed by IDSA team there, on how much is going to pensions and other things. A fairly large amount is going to pensions and salaries. So therefore, the actual capital expenditure would be much less than the overall numbers that we talk about. But I was asked to talk about history of India's offsets and defense acquisition policies. It's a challenge, but in the sense that there are broad three trends that I've noticed. One is a socialist phase that we have seen, as Air Marshal pointed out earlier. We did not allow, it's a strange policy, we did not allow India's manufacturing private sector to manufacture in India, but we were dependent on external players when we were importing fairly large number of equipment and other things. And of course, the Cold War context prevented India also from engaging with Western defense industrial groups and other sectors. The second phase that I noticed is the constrained and delayed liberal approach phase. While economic liberalization started in 1990s, the defense industry was allowed, the private sector was allowed only in 2001, and the FDI was only 26%. So I call it this as a constrained and a delayed liberal phase that we have seen. Almost while the rest of the private sector industry was growing, had a 10-decade head start. The defense industry did not have, specifically even given the fact that we were lagging behind in these areas. I think now we are in a sort of a hesitant liberal phase where FDI was initially increased to 49% in 2014 and then to 74 in 2020 and now 100% through government route. There have been series of, as earlier speakers pointed out, about the defense procurement procedures. Now it is called defense acquisition procedures. Some of the important dimensions that need to be noted there are a host of acquisition categories buy Indian, buy IDDM, and then buy and make Indian, buy global. There are a host of categories under which that we are trying to ensure that there is some indigenous content. In some cases it is 30%, in some cases it is 50%. So this whole range of categories is something that we have been dealing with, which again indicates the challenges of defense manufacturing in India. And that you have so many categories indicates that defense manufacturing is not so mature in India. The other important dimension that we need to keep in mind is that the defense offset policy as part of defense acquisition procedures, as Air Marshal pointed out and others pointed out earlier, we were trying to leverage capital acquisitions for technology upgradation. It was also an attempt to compensate for significant outflow of resources. And then there is also an attempt at simplifying procedures and sort of promoting transparency. The defense contracts worth earlier was for offset policy was 300 crores. Now it has been upgraded up to 2,000 crores. As a former military general once pointed out, large quantities of Moongfali will qualify for 300 crores these days. So maybe we should upgrade it to 2,000 crores, which is what has happened. And in terms of time frame, contract period plus 2 years, and a lot of disappointments have been encountered in this space because penalties have been levied, as Subimal pointed out. There are a lot of other avenues of discharge, whether it is direct purchase, execution of orders, investment, manufacturing, and other things. The other important dimension that we have brought in, learning from other countries, is the multiplier effect. That is, if you do technology transfer, you get greater multiplier effect on your offsets. The maximum multiplier effect is if you do technology transfers to DRDO and other places. This acquires importance because DRDO is today now can transfer patents, licenses for the patents it has. So therefore, this is a multiplier effect. Is something that needs to be looked at in these things. There are a host of other policies that we are doing in addition to offsets, that is region portal, that is promoting indigenization by facilitating partnerships between Indian private sector and the DPSUs. So if a DPSU has been importing and plans to curtail the import, then the private sector person can go through the orders and find out what are the areas that he can start contributing to the DPSUs. There has been an innovations for defense excellence, IDEX. It tries to give grants to R&D research. So that's another important area. Positive indigenization list, that is buying only from domestic sources. And of course, DRDO patents for Indian defense industry, royalty-free licensing is also being conceptualized. There are a host of challenges and opportunities, as we discussed. Discharges of offsets has been less than satisfactory, as Subimal ji pointed out. So the larger question that raises is, should offsets be cancelled? So is this a problem of the principle, or is this a problem of implementation? Sometimes some principles cannot be implemented, but sometimes the problem is with genuinely not able to give governance structures a place. So that needs to be looked at. But one of the things that we need to realize is offsets is not a silver bullet. It is one of the many things that need to go along in our investment, in our attempts to promote domestic defense manufacturing. So in this context, there are serious structural issues. One, government is the only purchaser. So this results in a lot of uncertainties. Yes, there is a 15-year long-term integrated perspective planning that has been articulated, but still there are a lot of uncertainties because the government is the only buyer. For instance, there was a lot of talk of howitzers and others. I mean, this is a brief feedback that I got from one of the manufacturers. Now there is a lot of talk about light tanks, given what is happening on India-China border. Given the limited budget, how will the Indian government place it purchase orders? Will it be on light tanks tomorrow, or will it be on howitzers and long-range artillery guns? So these are the kinds of questions that the industry is asking. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. The other important thing that we need to discuss is, as Air Marshal earlier pointed out, is the organizational issues. We have created, there is only a small team. I believe there is only one joint secretary dealing with offsets, maybe a couple more. But the point is, it's a small team, and the people who have engaged with this have shared the information that probably the team needs to be strengthened and increased as the starting point. And the second is there is need to bring in trained personnel from various ministries, because this involves commerce, trade, and so many other things. So that is something that needs to be looked at. The other thing that was raised was in my interactions is, do you have an operational research planning that has been done? How do you propose to operate offset management department, or the agency that is there, Department of Offset Agents? So how do you propose to, what is the amount of work that needs to be done? What are the, so the whole operational research needs to be done. If non-offsets or defense offsets are going to be counted in future, then it's all the more reason that we need to think about this independent defense offset agency. Subimalji, I can stop here. I can go on for the next thing. If we can discuss in the next session, if the other challenges and opportunities as well.
No, definitely, 6 minutes seems to be a little bit less. So both of you, you have spoken for 8 minutes, which is fine. We'll try and work this out. Thank you, Sanjay ji. I think very important points and observation, as you always do. I'll just come now to the third distinguished panelist, Kriti Upadhyaya. She basically is Vice President, Strategic Advisory C2CI Innovations Americas, and Founding Director of Indus Tech Council. And there's a lot of quality council and work that the Indus Tech Council has been doing. So Mr. Upadhyaya, I would want you to, come from the other side, the US approach to defense offsets, the implication and potential learnings for India. I think this is done, occasionally here and there in the various think tanks who talk about offset, but this is something that still is very, very useful here. The links between the offsets and transfer of technology, which is also a challenging issue. And this can help develop a strong defense industrial base also here, which of course is the intent of the offsets. And then the potential for establishing mechanisms such as the defense production and sharing arrangement and defense development sharing arrangement, which US has with Canada and Japan. So, those bilateral engagements and efforts, if they can be also institutionalized here, your perspective. So over to you, Ms. Upadhyaya.
Thank you, Mr. Subimal, and great to be in such august company. I'll try to, I'll speak on TOT in the next 4 minutes. I'll try to focus now on, what is really the way forward, because I think Sanjay ji has done a great job in getting us all set up with what defense offsets really are and what are the challenges, opportunities. I have a certain different view on this. I believe in a more of a middle path. Sure, when the CAG report came, they showed that most of these obligations are not being met. The larger issue was also, at least for the government of India, the fact that there's really increasing the upfront cost of the deal. So just because the foreign supplier has to meet this offset obligation, what they do is they put it within the contract. They just hike the price to sort of offset that rising price. So that was one of the major issues. But if you see, the dilution of the offset policy itself is it's more of an extreme step. There is more of a middle path. So the way we've been coming at it, I see it as a carrots and sticks approach. We've been coming at it as more of a sticks approach, mandatory offsets, 30% for anything above 3,000, above 2,000 crores. I think if you make it more of an open approach, carrots, incentivize, it could perhaps work better, because we can't just write off offsets that, hey, they're increasing the cost, folks are not meeting them. We are actually maybe not reaching contracts because offset obligations are not being met. But we also cannot ignore the fact that because of these offsets, you have this boom in places like Hyderabad, Bangalore, where you have these startups, MSMEs coming in. I mean, let's not forget, as late as like a decade back, private sector was like 2 decades back, private sector was not at all a major player in any of these defense exports. Today, we have a time where, I was just reading a few months back, the ex-Joint Secretary, Mr. Jaju, put out these stats that now, in just 2021 to 2022, 54% increase in India's defense exports. And in the past 5 years, there's been an 8x increase in India's defense exports. We've reached, we've crossed 1,300 crores, which is roughly 1.7 billion for the first time ever. And you'll be surprised that actually 70% of these exports are from the private sector. And out of those 70%, 40% are actually to the US. So there is a story there. And I do see this as a lag effect of some of the offset policy that we've had. So just doing away with offsets may not be the best strategy, but how do we go ahead then? So again, I think we should incentivize rather than saying that you have to mandatorily do it. Companies, who do pursue the offset obligation, they should get something like a tax credit, subsidized land acquisition, something along those lines. So don't mandate it, incentivize it. And I think the tax policy can really be used here as an incentive, or, land acquisition states can maybe do that. You can also, when I was looking at the offset obligation, the way that we can fill the offset obligations, there are about 5-6 ways you can do it. And it's quite restricting. I mean, when you say R&D, you're saying if you invest in R&D, it has to be only government approved. But, you look at countries like the US, the reason they've really built up this innovation ecosystem is because a lot of the R&D is coming from the private sector. So let them invest in, incubators, accelerators, private R&D facilities to meet their offset obligations rather than just, restricting them to say DRDO or to the TPSUs and the government-funded institutes. I also think that right now, all this investment is only in manufacturing. We should broaden this. Sanjay, you just spoke about IDEX. I mean, I love IDEX, right? IDEX is doing such great work, but IDEX startups, don't forget, they get some of the grant. The rest of the money they have to raise from other sources. Why can't we have folks just invest? These are all defense startups. What does it matter whether it's manufacturing or whatever? These are guys, who need money, who are already doing cutting edge stuff. So why can't they use, invest money in the IDEX startups to meet your offset obligations? And just startups in general. So what I'm talking about is if you have a term sheet, you get an you basically use that as a, as a criteria to meet your offset obligation. I also think, that the way that the US has these sort of production and development agreements with Japan and Canada, where they basically say, hey, Japan and Canada are buying so much defense stuff from the US, much like India. India is more and more buying more and more from like friendly countries, moving away from, buying stuff from Russia and so on to more to US, Israel, France. So as this increases, why can't we just balance it off by saying that, hey, if you're buying something, if India is buying something from you, then you do some of your manufacturing and development in India. And that makes sense because you have that cost advantage in India, right? Whether you're manufacturing, whether you're getting services, labor is cheap. We have great supply of STEM labor, something that the US is struggling with. And we also have, we can get manufacturing done in a fraction of the cost of what will be done elsewhere. So you can use that as an offset obligation as well. And finally, I think we need to focus on dual use tech. I think it'll be a little bit messy if we broaden this and make a whole national, offset policy. Let's focus on defense, but dual use, right? That's even what the US is doing. You look at the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, they're all focusing only on dual use technology, because right now, what we call the inverted scale of, right now there's a concept called the inverted flow of technology. The fact that earlier, all the military innovations, all the innovations were coming from the government, right? Think about it, the internet, all of that, right? All the great stuff. Today, everything comes from the commercial folks and your procurement timelines are so long, it's 1-2 years, and tech is changing this way, right? So you need you need to get a fast procurement timeline, and that's why the innovation is happening in the commercial sector. So dual use tech is really where the innovation is going to come from. So let's go ahead and just use dual use tech. That's also the focus of IDEX, by the way. So I think these are, and finally, I think they can also be, we can also include an offset obligation where, say, if an Indian company, so say if we are buying from a US company and that US company gets an Indian company to do some part of their services, which is not even related, it doesn't have to be in a critical sector, so it can be non-defense, but it's still services. It's still, as you know, US-India defense services is pretty much the bulwark of our trade relationship right now. So let's leverage that. Let's build on something that's already doing well and use it even for any sort of service obligations. And this will really help, give that leg up to the software and development and testing and engineering STEM capabilities that we have here. So what I've tried to do is really, I'll stop there. What I've really tried to do is put in some of our own thoughts that we think could help the industry here and could also offer a sort of a middle path towards offset. So with that, I'll conclude, and maybe in the next 4 minutes, I can talk more about TOT.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Upadhyaya. I think the reference to the dual use is really very, very pertinent. We'll come on that. Now I'll come to Lieutenant General Dr. Anil Kapoor, who's the Chairman, National Advisory Committee, Asset Management Society of India. Ajahn Kapoor, you have one of the best flares around the various global offset policies, like some of the offset experience of countries like Canada, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, I like Japan, Israel. I want you to touch on that one. Two, the relationship between the defense exports and the offset policy, can the offset policy aid in achieving the export targets for 2025 and beyond? Ms. Upadhyaya had also just referenced about the growing importance around defense exports, and as a policy government has been pushing now. I still remember many years back when I was heading General Dynamics here, I wanted to buy some ordnance, but there was absolutely no interest from here to sell that. But today it's a changed scenario. So General Kapoor, I want you to touch on both these aspects. So over to you, sir.
Good evening to all the distinguished fellow panelists, and thank you, Mr. Bhattacharjee, for this opportunity. I'd like to start by saying that, firstly, that defense offsets actually came up from the need of developing a capability. The crux was capability development. And therefore, when we look at a capability development, it often takes time to develop capabilities. However, it has been looked at as a very, very fast-track way of doing things. Now, so therefore, the first thing I'd like to say is that let us look at a long-term view for capability development. And I shall dwell upon this in the second part of the question that Mr. Bhattacharjee gave me. But let me walk you through the illustrious countries of the 130 who actually have an offset policy and are following it very, very deliberately. When we look at Canada, which is the first country you mentioned, it has a policy of offset which is upwards of 20 million Canadian dollars, right up to 100 million Canadian dollars. And if it is 100 million and above, the policy is 100% offset. And they've identified a value proposition through a number of initiatives that need to be taken at the national level. The first is developing the technology base in the nation. So that is the prime. The second is developing Canadian suppliers. That means targeting the MSMEs, because that's a big sector again. The third is defense industry, where they also invite subject matter experts to come and work in the industry and facilitate skill development. So that's a great idea. And we also need it for sure. The fourth big ticket is training. There's a huge amount of training that is required when you look at defense equipment. And therefore, that becomes a very formal way of technology transition management. And the last and the most important is exports. So they look at this as a dividend in terms of economics, national economics. And I think that's a great value proposition when we look at Canada. Now, looking at Saudi Arabia, we are all aware that they are synonymous with export of petroleum products, oils. However, from the time the kingdom is opened up, they've used offset in a very, very intelligent manner. Firstly, they've grown their agrarian economy, which was actually on a very low key. And the second is, being one of the largest importers of defense equipment and technologies, the second focus has been industrialization of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And while we say industrialization, they've looked at both ends, the high-tech end and the low-tech end. Because some of these low-tech technologies also are required in creating the velocity that you need for economy. And therefore, what they've done is they've diversified the whole thing into a number of sectors. A pharmaceutical sector, which has come up in a big way. Agrarian economy, I mentioned. Defense industry, so that they reduce their imports and convert it into an export manufacture. Food processing is another big area which they have got into. So these are some of the big tickets which they have got into, again, with a focus on their national economy and growth of the nation, the whole of nation approach. When we look at Israel, Israel is a great example of startup nations. And Kriti just mentioned about IDEX and other challenges, which is a huge, huge opportunity. I think what they developed over the 50 years is, again, a sector which is startups, because that is where a huge amount of technology confettis, if I may use the word, happen, but they have a huge amount of dual use. And when we look at it in the long run, it enhances the technical thresholds of the nation. So there is no doubt most of the countries today eat technology out of the hands of Israelis. And when we say eat, they are also focused on agrarian economy, and a lot of precision agriculture has happened through defense offsets. So therefore, these are some very nice examples, and I don't want to quote figures because I don't want to be very, should I say, I don't want to correlate. I'd rather be causative to bring home the lessons that we need to learn from these nations. I mean, Israel has been a very big aerospace industry. We know Israel aerospace industry, and Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and others, all the big names actually have a huge stake in Israel. And we've been talking of transfer of technology. It's not process transfer of technology. It is design transfer of technology. And in most cases, what has been actually experienced is that the designs given have been transformed into a better technology with a better IPR. And that is the value add that their industry and their R&D has done globally. When we look at Japan, now post World War II, Japan actually embraced a very close-knit relationship and synergy with US. And I think they focused hell of a lot on aerospace industry. In any case, it has huge dividends even in the auto industry. And they've looked at how their industry will grow in terms of electronics, because every technology has a huge amount of convergence in other technologies as well. So aerospace is one which has a huge congruence in other fields, and they've used that technology to the hilt. In any case, they are a nation always known for great manufacturing. So they've used that in a big way to create a lot of aerospace. And today, if we see, we talk of all the maritime aircrafts, P1s, P3 Charlies and all, they are the ones who actually have taken this technology forward through defense offsets. Again, when we look at Brazil, because that was another nation that you mentioned, Brazil again has been a very closely linked with US and Europe. In fact, they benefit hugely through their Embraer program, which is again aerospace related. And the dividends have been that we have they have their missile program, they have their aircraft industry program, and everything largely is export oriented. So their orientation again is on nation development and with a huge amount of export content. Now, if that is the framework in which some of these nations have worked, what is our learnings? I often like to speak on the three clarion calls of our country globally. The first is Atmanirbhar Bharat, the second is Make in India, and the third is Startup India. I think we are a resurgent India. We have always been like that, but I think today we are a conscious, resurgent India on a pathway of transformation. And that's why I think today's session is very, very relevant for us to find out what is it that we can do. Now, some of the speakers mentioned about China. We must know China started their sojourn in or journey in 1949 through a document called 100-Year Marathon. And everything was well documented in that 100-year marathon. I think we need to look at a long-term view and take offsets as a long-term view. And why do I say so? All of us own a car and we never keep a car more than 10 years. Even the government doesn't allow you to keep a car for more than 15 years today in India. But a defense equipment stays with that nation for over 50, 60 years. So it's a huge life cycle. And if you were to try and transform overnight, it is a huge cost center. So I think the first requirement is to take defense offset into a life cycle approach. Today, II Malat of Israel is opening a huge MRO hub in India. But it's not a defense offset. It's come to make profits out of it. So I
Well,
think
Kapoor,
there is a need.
I have to get you to speak in the next round because it's
Okay, I'll stop here and then carry on in the next round. Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you so much. Now we come to Mr. Partha from Lockheed Martin, who is the commercial lead India. And this is fascinating because you actually get a player who has an obligation to speak. So over to you, Partha.
Thank you, Mr. Subimal. Good evening, everyone, including the panelists. So I think a lot of speakers have spoken about my company, so thank you for that. And I'll definitely love to host you all in our places and our factories and see what actually we are making here. So coming to a few topics that I've been told to speak about. One is the aims of the offset policy. A lot of speakers slides we have shown everything. I do agree with a lot of it. The aim of the offset policy in India is always having macro objectives. Nobody bothered about the micro things. Everybody wants to be Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, buy from India, co-develop, co-produce. For whom? How many orders are there in India? So you are dependent on the foreign OEMs to buy everything that you produce because you have one particular thing, that's cheap labor. So are you driving your micro objectives? There is a confusion. There is a confusion. I'm sorry to say, I'm going to rub a lot of people in the wrong places. I apologize for that in beginning. So there is a confusion in our whole policy about what we want out of that offset policy. And if you don't understand it, just scrap it off. That's the ideology here today. And among the ranks of the MOD, it's more confusing because the interpretation is completely different between even the officers within the offset and management wing. This is today's truth, I should say. Now, what is the easy way they found out? The easiest way is to check every offset obligation from the angle of a purchase order. The purchase order that you place, which can be audited and then shown in a parliament or in any other forum as the numbers that you show. Is that the right way to do offsets? Is the globe doing it that way? So finally, everything of that purchase orders have transpired into simple component purchase that is happening today. Now, I think Mr. Cowshish is here, and there was the IDSA report that all these purchase orders are coming out of 15 companies, and that's all they're getting benefited. So the offset is not doing well in India, and we should scrap the tax. I must correct it everywhere that people don't look into the details here. The data is already based on few numbers that is there in the MOD. Let me give you an example. 30 years, Lockheed Martin is here. Somebody named the TLML, Tata Lockheed Martin Aerostructures Limited, and they told how beautifully Tata has built up their ecosystem here. So it started with Tata when Lockheed Martin first came here and built up their plant of C-130J empennages, which is not a simple machine. It's a very complex part. And it's the empennage is the only single source manufacturing in the whole globe. So India, all the C-130Js that is flying on the sky, more than 180 has Indian-made empennages on them. Now, what does that mean? That means those parts were purchased from more than 500 suppliers in India. Presently, 70 suppliers are directly producing them, creating more than 6,000 jobs in our tier one that we call as suppliers, who are all Indians. What that means further, 89% of those parts are made in India, 100%. So we are supporting today more than 500 suppliers with our JV. Out of them, 140 are MSMEs. So that's what it is. So if you want to speak more, we also have another JV which makes the cabin of the helicopters. And the US president flies in one of the S-92 where the cabin was manufactured in India, which Tata proudly promotes it everywhere in the globe. So that's what offset can create. That's what offset can do, but I don't see anywhere such news there. I don't know where the journalist goes in the wrong way or showing where the numbers goes wrong. Now, get me to the numbers goes wrong. So Lockheed Martin did offset obligations, completed 2 offset obligations in 2015. This is just for the information, 2022, we are seeing the new year soon in 2023. The offset credits are not yet audited. We have done much more than what we are supposed to do, but we are still lagging behind for a result when it's going to be audited. So what are the auditors doing? Again, back to the numbers. Let's not, I think I must not say that. So offset is doing its job. It's the angle where we are seeing it and which way we want to interpret the same thing. Now, I also want to mention, everybody speaks about offset. The ratio of offset obligation is not whatever you spend in India. So if I want to generate offset credit, I need to do 2x to create the IC content, and only the IC content is calculated as offsets. The indigenous content or whatever I do it in India. Most of the raw materials were not available in India, so we have to purchase it from outside, bring it here, import it, manufacture it, value add to it, and then get it back there. So everything that you see on the offset table is not exactly the number. So if you're generating, I'm just giving an example. If you're generating $100 million of offset, we are actually placing 200 million worth of orders and exporting 200 million. So each of our plant, all American companies or Indian companies, all other they're doing the same thing. So if I am generating $600 million of offset, I've actually placed order worth $1 billion. And that is added to the export. Please do understand that. Okay, another point is, because short time, there's a lot to speak, funds available. Funds available is not exactly, if I'm doing an offset obligation of, suppose a 500 million is not available with me. Please don't misunderstand that I'm going to come with 500 million and spend it. No, I have got a very less fund, which is very, very less, maybe 10%. I'm just giving a hypothetical number. And those, I have to adjust 10 million worth that. With that small money, I have to create that much of value in India. Please understand that it's a complex project. A lot of people don't understand that. They don't really do the integrities of how we manage offset and how you create value, how much of knowledge we bring in. A lot of people spoke about transfer of technology. Worst thing to do. Worst thing to do. I'll tell you one thing. It is better to do a knowledge transfer. A knowledge transfer is a long-term thing than transfer of technology. I can give you a technology what India wants. You transfer the technology and then you buy back. If I have the technology, I have the machineries, why should I buy back and make it made it from here? And the word cheap labor, that's not there any at all. The cheap labor doesn't matter. It's a very small, minuscule portion of the whole thing. So transfer of technology is knowledge transfer. I can give you an example. We did a knowledge transfer with Ashok Leyland in the year 2013. We gave a design of a vehicle, which is called as a light specialist vehicle. And today they have manufactured 100% make in India product, which Indian Air Force is using today, called LSV. Okay, coming to benefits and gain. Somebody spoke about the CAG audit report. Again, I think its auditors should now look at the procedures maintained by the offset management wing inside MOD rather than looking at the number that is produced in the paper. The internal audit is more necessary. How much did you miss? How much opportunities which you are supposed to grab did you miss is something which the auditor should check rather than checking what a foreign company did in India and how much they're going to get back out of that. So that was more than how much time did you wasted in that? How much big projects did you manage? So these are the things which there should have been done rather than doing it. Coming to a comment from F21, I think Air Marshal did it, that it's F16 coming into F21. I'm very thankful to you, sir. I had a Mahindra Jeep 1962. Can I compare it with Mahindra Thar today? I do have also example of Ferrari 125S. Is it Ferrari GTB 296? The same thing. Both are called as Ferraris, sir. They're not the same thing, sir. F21 is not F16. I'm sorry, I got it from Air Force guy, but I thought that you had much more knowledge than me in the same subject. Coming to another question of the TOEC, the Technical Evaluation Committee, when we do offsets. When we do offsets, the Technical Evaluation Committee do want us to give a whole plan of 7 years in the, what I have to tell them in the future, what I'm going to do in next 7 years. How is it possible? How is it possible that I played out a plan for the next 7 years, whom I'm going to buy, which company is going to come? There can be 3-4 companies which is coming with better technology. I have to buy from them. So there is no flexibility. Please understand. We are looking here to do business. We are not here to do charity. I'm not here from a charitable organization, and that money is not free. So offset is not free. It actually has a objective. And I'll end it with this, that please define those objectives. We are ready to accomplish it, and we will always be happy to be a partner here. We've already done so much of TOT transfers, so much of, there's endless examples. I can go on and on and on. But today, what I want to say is we have to be more specific when we talk about offset. And that is what other countries globally does. We are doing offsets in more than 100, almost 100 countries. And we are doing offsets more than $52 billion in the world. So exactly, we know what it is. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Partha. Lovely. So we have just now heard, the industry perspective and very, very clear, concise words from Mr. Partha Chowdhury. Now, I would come to the last speaker in this panel, most distinguished Amit Cowshish, who's a partner with Dua Associates and was a former financial advisor, acquisition in MOD, and you would have read him in various newspapers, have heard him in the past. He has one of the most meticulous understanding of the whole sector around acquisition as well as the offsets and all. So I think, sir, with all your wisdom and with all that you have heard, you have a great opportunity to cover a much larger field. But specifically, I still want you to touch upon how suggestions to facilitate vendors in carrying out offset obligations, tracking lapses in offset policy, etc. How we address them. What are the present avenues for the discharge of offset obligations? And then, of course, what is the criteria for triggering offsets? What is the implementing and monitoring mechanisms? I think Partha just mentioned about the audit part within the system. So where is DOFA in all of that? You have much better understanding of that. And of course, other challenges such as red tapeism that still continues, within the system. So that's quite a plate, but I'd want you to, since everyone has been around the 8-minute point, so 8 minutes. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhattacharjee. It's a privilege for me to participate in this discussion. Well, I'm sorry I lost your voice. I couldn't really make out what you were asking me, but nevertheless, since we are racing against time, I'll try to sort of share my ringside view of the Indian offset policy, the challenges it faces, and so on and so forth, which is basically the theme of today's webinar. I am reminded of Winston Churchill's quote when he said that it's a paradox wrapped in an enigma, and that is what Indian offset policy is. And I'll just give 3 or 4 examples, since we don't have the time, of why I say this and why I have quoted Churchill. The first sort of thing that comes to mind is that the MOD is unable to figure out whether it wants to persist with the offset policy or it wants it to, get phased out automatically. I mean, if you look at DAP 2020, it is first of all applicable, offsets are applicable only to buy global cases, but all single vendor cases are exempt, which means that all cases, all procurements on the basis of intergovernmental agreements, which would include foreign military sales program, these are all, in that category. Now, this covers pretty much, most of what we buy through Buy Global category on competitive basis. And therefore, if in future such cases are going to be far and few between, the offset policy will be only of some academic interest. To my knowledge, I say this with a lot of trepidation. Maybe there's something I'm missing here, but my sense is that if the focus is going to be on Indian vendors, on categories which make Indian vendors the prime vendors, like Buy IDDM and Buy and Make India and strategic partnership model, etc., then we are looking at contracts which will not entail offset obligation, and therefore to talk about the challenges of the offset policy is something which, to my mind, is a bit inexplicable. Secondly, I think right from the beginning, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about transfer of technology and so on. Let me first of all, mention that for the first about 7 years, the DPP did not even specify what the objective of the offset policy was. It was sometime in July or August 2012, and later on that was incorporated in the DPP 2013, that the objectives of the offset policy were defined. And even now in the AP 2020, the objectives which are mentioned in the document do not specifically talk about transfer of technology as an objective, explicit objective of the offset policy. It only talks about the fostering development of internationally competitive enterprises and augmenting capacity for research, design, and development. It doesn't talk about transfer of technology, and so my point is that the ministry officials bemoaning the fact that there has been no transfer of technology, etc., is something which is misplaced. Incidentally, Mr. Partha Chowdhury talked about that IDSA report. I was not really associated with that report, so I can't really comment on that. But actually, that report and also the CNAG's report reflects the kind of confusion in the mind of the MOD as it were, because it's not clear what are the outcomes that we are looking at, that MOD is looking at, whether the actual results on ground could be evaluated and assessed. So this challenge of what exactly is expected by the MOD continues to dwarf the Indian offset policy, and this is further reflected in the fact that on the one hand, the claim of the MOD is that it's a very, very liberal policy. The vendors are free to select the IOP, the vendors are free to select the avenues, etc., etc. And on the other hand, there is excessive control by the MOD. So at every stage, you have to go back to the MOD for approvals, which is which means that there is a contradiction between the stated objective of the policy and the way it is being implemented, and this has resulted in large scale what should I say, interim defaults. These are not the newspaper reports, media reports talked about defaults. These were not final defaults to my knowledge. These were interim defaults with reference to the annual targets which happened, and therefore it cannot be said that the program failed. But because of this confusion in MOD, whether they should be controlling everything, micromanaging the entire contract, with reference to annual targets, or let it be and look at only the outcomes. This has really been the bane of offset policy in the country. Can you also look at the approach that has been adopted by the MOD, which is of focusing on the penalties. The objective seems to be to sort of penalize the vendors for annual defaults, etc., rather than letting them implement the program and look at the final outcome of the program. This whole and the CNAG also commented on this, which is very strange, because they ought to have known better. MOD ought to have actually explained it to them better, that it doesn't matter whether the bulk of the program is being implemented in the initial years or toward the end of the offset performance period of performance. But they all tend to think that the bulk of the offset obligations should be discharged in the initial years of the POP rather than toward the end of the POP. Now, these expectations are not conducive to efficient, implementation of the offset policy. Lastly, I think one of the main issues which every program, whether it is acquisition program or offset program, it runs into difficulties. And I think the challenge before any bureaucratic setup is to face those challenges and find solutions. Unfortunately, DOMW, which incidentally is now, this is the replacement of DOFA, Defense Offset Management Wing. As has been rightly pointed out by other co-panelists, I think there is a certain lack of maybe expertise, maybe authority, maybe the mandate to ensure that the offset program or the offset contract is implemented with the ultimate objective of achieving the outcomes, rather than focusing on interim defaults, etc. But the challenge before the MOD is, what kind of training do you impart to the people who are supposed to manage this? Now, there are a lot of suggestions that we should rope in people from other ministries because they know about, commercial dealings and so on and so forth. But when I look at, if I place myself in the shoes of people who have to manage the offset contract, there is a contract in place. You have to actually oversee or monitor the execution of the contract with reference to the clauses of the contract, right? So whether you have experience in managing commercial transactions or not, whether you are a legal expert or not, you are bound by the clauses of the offset contract. Now, that is where the problem is. Unless you have an offset contract which facilitates, which enables the vendor without being subjected to excessive control at every stage, at every step, whether it is rephasing of the offset implementation schedule or changing the IOPs, etc. It allows the freedom to the vendor to achieve the ultimate objective. Regardless of who is managing or monitoring the offset contract, will tend to behave the same way the DOMW is presently behaving. So if we have to, assuming that that MOD wants to continue with the offset policy, first of all, it will have to perhaps make it clear as to what kind of cases are likely to attract offsets in future. Are such cases going to be, substantially high in number to warrant a refocusing of the offset policy, or should it be allowed to wither away? And maybe the objectives can be achieved through other means, through direct acquisition programs, etc. So I'll stop here because we don't have sufficient time, and I'm sorry, maybe I rambled a lot, but
no, thank you. I think very fact that you touched upon what is the real intent of the government, looking at the past few steps. So, we are very much beyond the schedule that was there. But, we'll just take the 3 questions at this point of time that I have. I'll take the questions and then we'll possibly do just a one-liner suggestion from each of you panelists to cross. So maybe, Mr. Kowshish, I still remain with you with the first question. Why the offset policy has faced so much of flex? That's a very short answer.
Sorry, why the offset policy is?
Policy has faced so much of flack.
No, I think I answered that question. It has faced a flag because, first of all, the objectives were never clear. If you look at the text of the policy, it is confusing. It's fraught with the contradictions. The focus is more on sort of penalizing the vendor rather than ensuring the outcomes.
Absolutely.
Right? And there is, the excessive control that MOD exercises right from the time. If you have specified in the offset guidelines as to who can be an IOP, then why is it necessary for the MOD to sit in judgment over whether the IOP suggested by the vendor is acceptable or not? Which means that there is something wrong with the guidelines, because you have not been able to fully explain who can be or who cannot be an IOP? Why do you need to actually approve the proposal to rephase implementation of the offset program? Now, all these questions, the excessive control and the inefficiency, I'm not sort of trying to run down anybody, but the fact remains that once a proposal is received in the MOD in writing, it has to be subjected to scrutiny. It goes from desk to desk. It takes time, and everybody has a different opinion because the policy itself is very confusing. Now, these are some of the reasons why the offset policy, and also, Mr. Roy Chowdhury talked about the IDSA report. The expectation. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with the fact that and I think he pointed it out, that about 87% of the offset business was concentrated in 15 companies. How does it matter? Because down the line, they spawned maybe 1,000 or 2,000 MSMEs. So it doesn't really matter. In any case, this was not the objective of the offset policy that there should be, say, 100 IOPs or 200 IOPs. So the basic problem was with the way the policy was formulated. And I say this with due respect to everybody, because I was also there in the ministry that time. Right. The haste in which it was done was...
Thank you, sir. I'll just take another question. Sanjay ji, do you want to just touch upon where do you see the future of offsets in this age of Atmanirbharta?
Yeah, one of the things that people have raised questions in the program, even in the agenda, is should we go into non-defense offset areas, non-defense areas for offsets? I've spoken to few people, and there is a perception that if you are doing offsets in non-defense, it has to be in very high-tech and very carefully calibrated dual-use technologies. For instance, drones and other areas where we are manufacturing certain things, but we need certain knowledge transfers, as earlier speaker pointed out, on various other small components such as sensors and those things. So that's one area that, so if you are going to do it, you need to have a clearly defined plans for platforms at a micro level, as was pointed out, in terms of defining how to operationalize offsets in these dual-use technologies. Related to this, as one of the partners pointed out, is that much of the dual-use technologies will be defined by civilian regulation. For instance, for drones, there is no civilian, how to use drones in civilian areas and others. The perception is that tomorrow the use of civilians is much more in civilian areas than in military areas. Of course, the quality and military grade are qualitatively different. But point is, you need to have civilian regulations, rules and regulations and procedures in place for dual-use technologies also to function. Thank
you. You're on mute.
Yeah. The third and the final question that's come from Mr. Krishnagrant. With the setting up of defense industrial corridors in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, is this way a better check on offsets? Can this be done? May I ask General Kapoor to respond?
Right. In fact, the defense industrial base and the industrial corridor is a great opportunity of transforming the nation. In fact, I alluded to the Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India and Startup India. The basic fact is that when you start doing some kind of a manufacturing of defense equipment, there's a limit to which your own army or air force or navy can absorb. Right. As an example, you make light tanks. What after, if the requirement is 400, what happens after 400 tanks? Please tell me. So therefore, exports is perhaps the best answer. And when I say, in fact, that was part of the question that you had given me in the previous one. And I felt that there is definitely a need when we look at a time window. The time window we are looking at is not 2 years. It's too short a time window. We have to extend it to a life cycle support. It has to be a handhold, if I may say. It's like a marriage. If I may use the word, defense offset is a marriage for a purpose, and the purpose is capability development over a period of time. Today, technology has a very short cycle. I mean, gone are the days when Moore's law and others were followed. They are not being followed any longer. And with these startups, there's definitely a huge inspiration and motivation that has come into this field. So I think we need to lever technology. We need to lever dual technologies, and we need to lever life cycle sustainment as the new way forward for defense officers.
Sure, I take the hand-holding part as your last comment. That's very relevant comment. Partha, do you want to add something? Just one liner, just to end. I'm almost going out of time.
So, if you want to talk about defense corridor, one is in UP, one is in Tamil Nadu.
No, overall, on the whole policy as such, or what is the roadmap? Just one line.
I think, do we have orders to even put up that plan? So I'm very straightforward in that. How much time does the MOD take every time to even give one single order? And if you think that I will bring up a new manufacturing unit here, again the question comes up, for whom?
Right. Thank you, Ms. Upadhyaya. Do you want to just give one point? What should be the direction?
Sure, yeah, I think that definitely give more flexibility, focus on, as all folks have said, focus more on implementation. I think that even the surrounding ecosystem has to be bolstered, right? You'd have to go over our licensing policies. I mean, as Partha said, nobody's here to do charity, within the TOT clause, when you say, you have to give full on TOT and not even cost a licensing fee. I mean, come on, who's going to do it? Banking provisions need to work on. And I think just the way that we're doing in India for across the bat, trying to decriminalize a lot of offenses. I think, again, not having the stick approach and really going for the carrots approach and incentivizing folks to pursue offsets is really the way forward in my mind. Thanks.
Thank you. Air Marshal Matheswaran, I know you have a lot to put here, but you had used the word ineffective, right at the beginning. So how do we make it effectively? How do we make it effective?
So one of the possible ways we can look at is, and I was looking at the UK, some changes have come in, and incidentally, the Europeans have practiced offset for ever since the post Second World War. The F-16 program is a very excellent example that I can give of Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. We don't have time to discuss that, but the UK idea is that they are handling with offset evaluation. In our system, the evaluation comes after you've declared who's L1 and who's the winner, which actually is problematic one. Whereas they are looking at combining the offset, and now you look at a person who brings value, and then choose the winner. One. Second is, in any proposal, offset is not mandatory. So somebody may give an offset proposal, somebody may not want to give, and you combine all that and take an evaluation. So it's an interesting thought, but I think more thought has to go into it. But I'll also, Subimal, I want to address one point that Partha mentioned. The F-21, the basic platform is still the F-16. I've flown the Block 52, I've flown the Block 60, and the 21 is hardly any different from the Block 60. That's one. As a person, we are in an age of upgrades, and platforms may be old. You may bring in sensors, electronics, avionics, and bring in new weapons and beef up. A third generation platform can become a 4.5 generation platform. But a fifth generation platform needs a different design as well. So that we need to remember. As a person who's commanded the flight test center as an experimental test pilot, and a person who's spent a lot of time in acquisitions and laying down the rules, I know what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So, we are almost out of time, and I can't keep Mr. Pradeep Mehta, the founder of CUTS, and who has built wonderful policy formulation support in so many sectors from not addressing here. There are a lot of specific takeaways from each of you, and the brilliant team at CUTS is going to put forward, and I'm sure it actually helps the policymakers. And I think it was really fantastic hearing from you. I wish we had more time. I saw Mr. Bipul Chatterjee saying we must have another round soon. So I look forward to that. And over to you, Mr. Mehta.
Thank you very much, Subimal. I heard just the last round of the single sentences that you spoke about. Somebody spoke more than one sentence. But anyway, I could get the drift of the understanding of the discussions. And of course, it's very fascinating. And undoubtedly, what I could also agree with Bipul and you, that we need to have another second round with the kind of recommendation that we come out from this particular event, in order to settle them and to see how we can take it forward as a solid, concrete policy recommendation. First of all, let me record my appreciation to the esteemed speakers and panelists for their valuable contribution to our webinar on the India's defense offset policy, challenges and opportunities. Hearing and learning from panelists have educated all of us here on the evolution of India's offset policy, the avenues it offers for our growing industries, and what is to be done with India's defense offset policy. We received diverse comments and opinions from a range of experts, sparking off a conversation on this important topic. This webinar has helped us to have a better understanding of the opportunities and challenges in this very important sector of the defense ecosystem. The lapse in offset obligations has amounted to a whopping $2.24 billion as of last year, as stated by the Minister of State for Defense in the Parliament. This amount could have been used productively if the right steps were taken by our policymakers. Well, I heard a point made that you could look at the future of offset and may not even have offset when you're comparing any kind of deals from one to the other. But there are successful cases around the globe, such as Saudi Arabia, Canada, Japan, and Israel, to name a few, which indicate that India can also benefit from the policy, but it would require a whole of government approach, which is often very difficult because a government works in silos. With the recent initiatives such as the Defense Acquisition Procedure 2020, Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, the defense industrial corridors, etc., the time is ripe for a relook at our offset policy, as also highlighted during this discussion. This would aid India as we move forward towards becoming a major exporting hub. I mean, what is got sort of evident is that we need to look at it from the angle of exports as well, which has another dimension which I'd like to mention, that if in case we are looking at exports as a major thing, we need to ensure that it is the private enterprise in India which gets into the defense sector because of the nature of transactions which happens in defense deals. It's not always very over the table, which determines as to how purchase is done in importing countries, particularly in the developing world. But the ecosystem is expected to catalyze indigenous production of defense and aerospace-related items and reduce India's imports while promoting the export of those items to other countries. With the new outlook, government may intend to develop a defense manufacturing ecosystem having conducive conditions, including supply chains for giving push to production, gaining from transfer of technology, testing and certification, to create economies of scale and facilitate development of internationally competitive defense enterprises in the country. As mentioned during the panel discussion, there needs to be a rethink given to the objectives to facilitate innovation-based transformation. This would require designing and addressing the loopholes in the offset policies of the past. Following today's deliberations, it is evident that the offset policy needs to aim at a new national offset policy, which would target overall economic development and industrial benefit. A renewed national offset policy will not only benefit in achieving the target of India's growth to a $5 trillion economy, but generate much required employment generation, which is one of the most crucial things that we are facing today, innovation, and getting the latest technology to India. This would be advantageous as we face a two-front border threat in this ever-changing geostrategic world. In this vein, there are three objectives of a renewed offset policy: economic development, technology transfer, and industrial benefit. As also mentioned by the panelists, I would like to flag the need to have spin-off benefits from defense industrial base to other sectors. The spin-off effects can be a direct flow from the offset policy like that followed by Canada, or an indirect spillover to another sector. Diversifying to other sectors would ease up the procurement process, widen the scope of offset to more civilian sectors, and have many positive trickle-down effects. Overall, it should focus not only on one sector, but have an overall effect for the entire economic growth. Lastly, looking at the successful single window management of offsets like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Spain, we must relentlessly, I have not studied the UK model, which was being suggested, and resolutely propose that the Defence Offset Facilitation Agency, which currently functions under the Ministry of Defence, to be moved out of the Ministry of Defence. We propose it to be moved to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry or the Department of Economic Affairs. This is to keep an arm's length so that they're able to act independently. And there are several examples like this which I can quote. This would be in the larger interest of the Indian economy and help manage the whopping offset lapses and check other imbalances and hurdles. With the culmination of this rich debate, we hope to move from conversation to action, can relay and amplify the agenda to our policymakers. Finally, my deepest appreciation for the panelists and the attendees, and of course, Subimal as moderator for their valuable contributions and a fruitful discussion. And as I said, we'll come out with the recommendations matrix, and we hope that we'll be able to get your comments on it in order to take it forward as a policy recommendation to the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pradeep ji. So is it over to you, Puru?
Puru?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for this fruitful, and as we said, the time was less, but we'll have another discussion, round 2. So look forward to that. And thank you again, everyone, for making up, being here. Have a good day.